Today I'm going to talk to you about how to build strong security guardrails in the AWS cloud with minimal effort. Now, let me ask you this. It's a bit of a rhetorical question, but I really do want you to think about this. What's the number one problem related to security in the cloud? Now, a lot of the time, people are going to say it's hackers, right? It's always in the basement with a hoodie and for some reason, fingerless gloves, typing in darkness, trying to hack into things. Now, I understand why you respond that way, but that's not the problem. Some people are going to say nation states, so far more organized, some big government conspiracy, maybe a military effort trying to hack into your stuff. Again, I totally understand why you'd say that, not the problem. Maybe you go with it's organized cyber criminals. Now this is far closer to reality. This is the vast majority of cybercrime is conducted by organized cyber criminals, but that's not the number one problem when it comes to security in the cloud. The number one problem when it comes to security in the cloud is actually just misconfigurations. That's right. It's taking a cloud service and not actually configuring it in the way that you intend or you expect. So you're going to see things that happen that you didn't think were possible, but they end up being a result of just one option being flipped the wrong way, or perhaps a parameter not sent with a specific API call. It's a misconfiguration. But really, those misconfigurations, when you cut it through all the noise, cut through all the hype reported around breaches, really, they're simply just mistakes. People make mistakes all the time. Given the dynamic environment in the cloud, given the pace at which things are moving, given the just sheer number of choices that we have for features and functionality in the AWS cloud, it's completely understandable that at some point you're going to make a mistake. The goal is to make sure that that mistake doesn't result in an unintended breach of customer data, or a privacy breach, or a security breach that causes some sort of large incident. That's what we want to avoid. But at the end of the day, the number one problem in security in the cloud is misconfigurations, which really just means mistakes. People are making mistakes, and that is causing some security problems. And the good news is we can tackle that. Understanding that, expecting what those are, now we can start to take steps to prevent these mistakes from happening, because it is under our control. Unlike hackers, unlike nation states, unlike cyber criminals, that's an external party. A mistake is something that we've done unintentionally to ourselves. So that gets us to the topic of guardrails. But before we get there, I want to just solidify on the goal of cybersecurity activities. There's a lot of complicated definitions out there, but I think this one is the simplest. It's truest to form, and it's going to keep you and your team on track. The goal of cybersecurity is simply to make sure that systems work as intended and only as intended. That covers stopping all of the bad stuff, but it also makes a focus on covering off these misconfigurations or mistakes and expanding that idea of security into where it should be in building robust and resilient systems. So keep that one in the back of your head, making sure that systems work as intended and only as intended. So let's talk a little bit about security controls. You're probably familiar with a bunch of them already, things like firewalls, intrusion prevention systems, anti-malware, application control. All of these things are different types of security controls, and they all have their use. Now, it's really best to sort them into two categories. There are detective controls, which is something that gives you the ability to say, I found this. Right? So it's just looking at data, it's looking at activity, and it's finding something and alerting you to that fact. The other category of security controls are preventative. I stopped this. So this is the difference between an intrusion prevention system and an intrusion detection system is a good example. An intrusion detection system is looking at the contents of a network communication packet, of a TCP/IP packet or UDP packet or whatever the case may be, and it's looking at that and it's looking for malformations, it's looking at known attack structures, things like that. And if it finds something, an intrusion detection system raises its hand and says, I found this. An intrusion prevention system, on the other hand, does the exact same thing, except when it finds something, it throws the packet out. It drops the network communication. So it prevents it. I stopped this from happening. Detective controls, preventative controls. Both have their place, because obviously with a preventative control, when it's taking action, there's more risk that it could disrupt your business activities, and you may or may not be okay with that level of risk. But regardless of the type of control, here's basically how they work. Something is happening, and it could be something malicious. It's something enough to trigger a security control, and then it needs to make a decision. You need to have the security control making a call one way or the other. And what will normally happen is that there are three possible answers. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wait a minute, there's 3 possible answers. Most of the time, we see security controls through the lens of 2 answers. Yeah, well, there's 3. There's yes, there's maybe, and there's no. Okay, so yes, no, and a maybe. Now, the yes and the no are actually what we're all very familiar with, what we're all very comfortable with, and the easiest to set up. They're allow or deny controls. I saw this, I was fine with it. I saw this, I freaked out, and I stopped it, right? So in allow and deny decisions, we have a bunch of services from the AWS cloud that will help us implement these types of security controls, not to mention third-party open source or APN partner controls as well. So things like AWS IAM, the Identity and Access Management System. This entire system is set around granting permissions. It's default deny to everything, and then you can allow based on certain criteria. So you can allow Mark to read that object in a S3 bucket. You can allow Mark to launch EC2 instances, things like that. So allow and deny, AWS IAM is probably the go-to, and it is the foundational security control within the entire AWS cloud. But there's a bunch of others as well. There's things like the AWS Network Firewall. There's AWS WAF, or the Web Application Firewall, as well as AWS Shield. Now, AWS Shield is the one that everybody forgets about because it's on by default and you never ever have to deal with it. It's just a service that AWS runs that they branded because they do sell Shield Advanced, which is they will help you in the midst of a distributed denial of service attack. They actually have incident responders there to help you. But all these controls are allow or deny. They're yes or no. And what we're talking about today is the maybes, because the maybes are where guardrails come into play. And I think this is really, really fascinating because as much as we want to go to the yes or no, maybe is far more interesting, simply because there are scenarios where I want you to have this ability, but I want you to apply some judgment in using it. So am I going to allow you to read or write to this S3 bucket? Can be a yes or no answer, but will I allow you to make buckets public? Potentially, it really depends, maybe. So there's some accounts where I'll turn on block all and you won't have that choice. I will say, no, you can't do that. However, in other scenarios, I want you to apply judgment and I want you to answer that sometimes is basically the answer. And guardrails are going to help lead you into a more secure decision by default when you, the builder, have been given the power. So that's where they fit into the scheme. We've got yes and no controls, which are sort of standard security controls. Guardrails are going to help us with those gray areas, the maybes. Okay, so let's walk through some examples because I find when we apply them, when we see this in real life, this makes way more sense to a lot of people, okay? And our first example is going to be accessing an EC2 instance. Now, personally, I'm not a fan of having users access EC2 instances. So logging into these instances in production or even development, there are some challenges here, right? There's security issues that maybe you have a hard line and you just say, no, nobody can SSH or RDP into an EC2 instance. And that's probably a better security posture. But the vast majority of us are used to this. This is something that we're used to doing, and it's something that's normally allowed, but you don't want it to happen all the time. So you want to put a guardrail in place to help highlight this behavior and some of the challenges it poses to your security posture. So we look at this structure, we'll say we have a user. That user is logging in via SSH into that EC2 instance. And here we need some sort of guardrail so that this is just not a regular activity. It's Monday, I'm going to log in. Like, we want to get away from that. We want to put some pause into this flow so that the user starts to question, do I really need this access? Okay, and the way we're going to do that is by putting in a very simple structured guardrail. We're going to do it with a little bit of a serverless implementation, ironically because we're leveraging it off of a server. So once you log into your EC2 instance, we're going to have CloudWatch logs register that login. And that's on, you can enable that very, very simply in any AWS managed EC2 instance image. The CloudWatch logs agent is already there. You just need to turn it on and start sending those events back into the CloudWatch service. But what we want is that login event. So when I log in, when Mark logs into EC2 instance APC, we are going to create a log event based on that. Again, it's already pre-configured by default. And then that is going to send a CloudWatch event. Again, CloudWatch, fantastic service, love it to death, but it's actually 3 services. There's metrics, events, and logs, but they're all lumped under the same thing. It is what it is, you just have to deal with it. So we're using logs on an agent on the instance to send that occurrence of me logging into the EC2 instance via a CloudWatch event. And once that event is in place, we're then going to trigger an AWS Lambda function. Okay, so that function is going to receive the event from CloudWatch logs of a user having logged into the instance. And then what we're going to do inside that Lambda is we're actually going to line that user identity up, and we're going to send it to Slack. Now, this is an example that was given to me and I've used time and time again a few years ago, having a discussion with an enterprise where they set this up and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. Now, I wish I could credit them in this, but I requested that they were not. This wasn't for public sharing, so I've anonymized it, but it is a brilliant scenario because what they're doing here is they're using Slack where most of their employees live, and they are bubbling up a yes or no. So when I log into an EC2 instance, CloudWatch logs that, sends it to CloudWatch events. CloudWatch events sends it to Lambda or triggers a Lambda. Lambda then looks up my username and hits me up in Slack and says, hey, Mark, did you log into this EC2 instance? Yes or no? Now, if I say yes, it will pop up with a little education message saying like, okay, that's fine, you have that right, but maybe you want to try to cut that down, blah, 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 right? Opportunity for in-context learning, which is very important when you're trying to change behavior. So instead of just going like, no, you're not allowed to do that, what we've done is set up a little guardrail here to start to educate your users. Like, hey, this is something you probably shouldn't be doing all the time, but we understand that you have that ability to do it for a reason. Maybe you need to fix something, you need to find a new bug, maybe you need some sort of access, whatever it may be. Okay, but if I say, no, this wasn't me in Slack, if I answer, no, I didn't log into this, that a Lambda will actually then kick off an incident response process because you ask the user like, hey, Mark, you logged into this instance, right? And I go, no, it wasn't me. Okay, now we need something to worry about. So not only have we set up a guardrail here, we've also set up a bit of a sensor to verify when we see malicious intent on our instances. It's like a win-win, okay? So keep this one in mind. It's not something we want to stop completely, but it's something that we want to strongly discourage, and we've used a guardrail to gently guide that user behavior in the direction that we want, okay? Overall, why do we want this thing? Like I said, it's a behavior that we want to change over time. We don't want to just say hard no. That's where security teams get really bad reputations. So we want to gently guide the users to the decisions that we want. Now, you may be arguing for access. Well, any data that you're getting from those instances should actually be automated, automatically exported into some sort of analysis pipeline. So if you need logs off that system, you should be using CloudWatch logs or a third-party log service to get all that data off. You shouldn't have to log in. Similarly, any problems that you're fixing, like if you're applying a patch or tweaking a setting, you should be doing that in code, whether that's your application code or infrastructure code, earlier in the pipeline and then redeploying. You shouldn't be making changes in production because people make mistakes, right? And this harkens back to the long days before we didn't have a choice, when you had to log into every one of the servers you had and make the same change. I remember my days on Saturday nights and change windows. Those used to be a thing. We used to have to work Saturday nights. And you would sit there and go, okay, I've changed server 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and somehow you skip 7. You're like, oh, crap. But you don't figure that out, of course, till Monday, right? So the idea here is we want to put systems in place to be doing the work that people may be doing today on their EC2 instances. But until those systems are in place, until people get used to that, we use this guardrail to gently guide them in the direction that we want to go. Second one, this is something that just happens all the time. It's just natural. It's similar to when you buy a lot of storage, your data will always expand to fill that storage. It's just how it is. You will always have too many IAM permissions assigned to different things. And that's not a great thing, right? You want to keep permissions following the principle of least privilege, where they're only assigned the permissions they're required to do the task at the time they're required to do that task. Now, for IAM permissions, we're going to see a scenario where they're granted to a user. And in that case, we are going to want to put up a guardrail because we don't want to prevent people expanding their access within the environment because there's totally legitimate reasons why you would need this. However, we also want to discourage it, just like the last one. So we're going to use a guardrail again, gently guide people over into the behavior that we want. So when we see an IAM permission granted to a user, again, we're going to use a CloudWatch event. Now this is automatically occurs in the background. You just need to capture it to send off a trigger. And in this case, we are again going to go to Lambda. Love it. This is a great pattern. CloudWatch event fires off a Lambda, and that Lambda is then going to go into CloudTrail and search CloudTrail. CloudTrail, a lot of people think of it just as the thing that logs all our API calls. It actually has a pretty robust search feature within it as well, which I suggest you fully take advantage of. If not, you could go through Athena to search the data that's sitting in the S3 bucket without pulling it out of the S3 bucket. But in this case, what we're going to do is when a permission is assigned to somebody, we're going to trigger this event through CloudWatch events to a Lambda. In that Lambda, we're going to search CloudTrail to figure out what they have access to now, or if there's a group or something else that would be a better fit for them. And then again, we're going to go back to Slack and tell them and say, hey, Mark, you granted Fred these permissions. Maybe you don't need to do that because there's a group that covers that. Or you don't need to do that because those permissions actually are too broad. We're going to scope that down a little bit. So you have an opportunity, again, to interject and to educate in context. And that's absolutely key, I found over the years for security education, is that you want to educate at the moment when people are doing it. If I sit you down and do a day-long course in security and say, hey, this, all these things are bad, all these things are good, you're allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that, you're not coming out of there with a ton of information. You're coming out of there with 1 or 2 nuggets and hopefully can remember some of the other things to look them up. That's not a great way to educate people. This kind of a guardrail where somebody's actually trying to accomplish a task and you're like, hi, excuse me, just 1 sec. You might want to think about this instead. Here's some data that will help you do that, or better yet, click here and I'll do it for you. This kind of intervention, this contextual intervention, is what guardrails are perfect for. They handle that maybe situation, right? I want to give you the ability to expand permissions for users in your environment, but I don't want you to go hog wild and just give everybody admin. So I'm going to take the opportunity when you are assigning permissions to educate in context. Now, why is this? Well, because permissions always creep scope over time. People just keep getting more and more permissions. It's basically like the law system. Very rarely do you repeal a law. You always just add a new one to cancel out that old one. IAM permissions are basically the same thing. We're just going to add more permissions and more permissions and more permissions. We're almost never going to go back and sweep them to remove them. Little tip, you should go back and sweep them. You should absolutely remove them. But also another tip is that you should be granting permissions to groups, not to users. You should add users into groups and then give the groups the permissions so that the users have very little direct permissions assigned to them. Ideally, they should have permissions for granting roles or assuming roles, but that should also be in groups. And that just makes it easier because then that way, if somebody leaves, you don't lose that permission set and you understand what tasks and what permissions line up together. So you should be managing that through groups. And again, like I said, permissions are almost never. I mean, I said rarely here just to be polite. Nobody ever removes permissions. You absolutely should be, but it's just a pain. It's one of those activities that people don't really do that often. So hitting them in context and saying like, hey, did you really need to do that is absolutely key. And again, if you're using roles to manage users, you should be using, groups to manage users. You absolutely should be using roles for specific tasks because people also don't need permissions permanently. If you need to check if the backup is running, you don't need to do that all the time. You probably need to do that once a week. So assume that role when you need to do it. Not having those permissions sitting around granted but unused is an absolutely key thing for reducing your security risk and reducing that attack surface. So some great ideas or some great reasoning why this guardrail is highly effective. So let's look at a third and final example here. And this one relates to secrets. I'm a big fan of AWS Secrets Manager, but there are some challenges around it, not to mention, not the smallest of which is the pricing, because people look at it and go, well, I should be using Parameter Store instead. I like Secrets Manager because it's this designated thing that's very clearly for special sensitive stuff. It's for secret stuff. So our last scenario, our last guardrail is here. You have a secret, it's something, and it's stored in Secrets Manager, but now you need to grant access to that secret, right? It's no good if it just stays there, it's in its vault and nobody ever accesses it. You need resources and people to be able to pull this secret out in certain contexts. So again, we're going to use a very similar pattern here. Secrets Manager, when we see activity via CloudWatch events for Secrets Manager, primarily for the storage of a new secret or application of new permissions to a secret, then what we want to do is fire off a Lambda, and within our Lambda, we're going to leverage IAM Access Analyzer. Now this is going to give us our ability to check to see who can actually access this thing. And that's going to give us a better idea of like, hey, did I actually keep this secret? Because I've seen this time and time again where somebody dumps a secret into a Secrets Manager, and then to get things working, all of a sudden they've got a really broad resource policy on it. And that's not a good thing. It's right in the name, secret. Keep it as secret as possible. So IAM Access Analyzer will help you leverage this and look at who has permissions to access it or what has permissions to access it. And then of course, if that's too broad, fire back to our old friend Slack. By the way, this is the official Slackbot icon. I absolutely love it. But most of us work daily in Slack, and this could be subbed out for Microsoft Teams. This could be subbed out for email. It could be any tool. The point is we're using whatever the users are most comfortable with to communicate back to them and say, hey, oh, you know that thing you're trying to keep secret? You've actually opened that up way broader than you should have, or than you realized, or maybe not. We're not sure. Here's the information, make a decision. Is this yes or no? So again, perfect scenario for a guardrail. So why are we using this guardrail? Well, we want to keep those secrets, But just like permissions for users and roles and groups, scope creep comes in, right? When you're trying to get the secret used in production, you start to add more permissions until it works, and you rarely go back and remove things. So you can see that scope creep come in. And there's a lot, be honest, as much as I like this service, there's a lot required to properly connect it into things. So to make sure that Lambdas, especially cross-account, can actually access this secret, it gets really complicated really quickly. That's where the IAM Access Analyzer comes into play, and that's why we've used it in this guardrail, because people make mistakes. This is a recurring theme. People absolutely make mistakes, and that's okay. We're using this guardrail again to raise our hand and to say, hey, Mark, did you actually think that, that was the right call? Did you mean to open this secret up to the world? Did you mean to make sure that any AWS account could access this? Did you mean to just only lock this down to Jolene? What were you trying to do here? And again, context, we're using the guardrail to educate in context so that people understand, like, oh, wait, no, that change I just made is bad, as opposed to a week from now going, that change you made that you totally forgot about and don't actually remember why you made, that was bad. That's the whole point of a guardrail. We're getting them in context in the moment. So what are your key takeaways here? We've talked about a couple different examples. We've talked about the different security controls. We've highlighted some use of guardrails. Now, AWS has a bunch of pre-configured guardrails. They just launched a new set available with Control Tower. You could implement them through AWS Config, which is actually just custom Lambda rules in the background. I like this kind of pattern we've been talking about leveraging CloudWatch events to fire off Lambdas to educate in context, because I think when you look at security controls, you've got those yes, you've got the no, then you want that maybe. So let's pull out our examples and look at a generic pattern. Something happens. I don't know what it is, something. It emits some sort of CloudWatch event. Now, almost anything you do in the AWS cloud actually has a CloudWatch event behind it. Anything in CloudTrail is a CloudWatch event. And there's a bunch of other stuff that you can set up as custom events as well. So we have these events and we want to send them to Event Bridge. Again, very low cost for Event Bridge in general, and serverless. And the reason why we're sending it into Event Bridge is because then based on the content of the event, we can route it to where we want. So Event Bridge will now emit an Event Bridge event. And little trick here is that CloudWatch events and Event Bridge events are built on top of CloudWatch events. It's just they're a little bit more flexible, and they include third-party services, APN partners, things like that. So we have something in our environment that emits a CloudWatch event. We're going to capture that in Amazon Event Bridge, and then we are going to have an Event Bridge event that we will route wherever we need to go. So in our case, we've seen Lambda a bunch of times. Maybe we are kicking off a new build in code build, for the 10 people that use code build. Or maybe we're kicking off a message into Slack. The goal here is this with generic pattern based on the contents of that event. Amazon Event Bridge will route it to the appropriate receiver. Now, here's the key. This is what makes this whole thing work, is that your trigger, your receiver, can actually send it back to Event Bridge. So in our case, we had all of our Lambdas directly triggering Slack. That's a waste, you can deduplicate that code by just having one Slack Lambda, and anything that comes in with the proper webhook URL, it will be formatted properly. So we're gonna actually process most of our stuff in Lambda and then send it back into Event Bridge to go to Slack. This generic pattern is very flexible, it's very scalable, it makes it really, really easy to manage because all your business logic, all your security guardrail logic is now sitting in Event Bridge as a set of Event Bridge rules that match specific patterns. Okay, very straightforward, very simple, very low cost to implement at scale, and it's entirely serverless in the backend, so you're not running additional infrastructure. Remember, the goal here, we have security controls that handle yes and no. What we need is guardrails that handle the maybe case. This is a scenario where we have no clear yes or no answer, but we have a good opportunity to educate, to inform, and to highlight, like, hey, you're doing something that could have some risk. Here's the risk. Here's what you need to know about it. Make an informed decision. That's what the guardrail is really there for. It's not to prevent you from doing something. It's to give you the information you need to know at the time you need to know it to make the best decision for you and your environment. Because at the end of the day, we're all people. People make mistakes. It totally happens. The idea with a guardrail, again, in addition to that education and context, is to help you make the right call. So to reduce those mistakes. That's it. It's not that complicated. Using this very simple, scalable, serverless, generic, low-cost pattern, you can make a lot of great guardrails that are customized to your environment, because it doesn't just have to be AWS services. You can have your application spitting these things out. You can have build scripts. You can have anything you want using this pattern to highlight, hey, you might want to think twice about this. Here's some additional information about that. That's really the goal of a guardrail. I hope you can see the value of that and implement it within your environment. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. My name is Mark Nunnikhoven. I'm an AWS Community Hero. You can hit me up online at marknca or go to my website, markn.ca. Hope this has been useful, and I can't wait to see what guardrails you build for your environment and hopefully share with the rest of the community.
All right. Hopefully that was enlightening for you. I learned a bunch of stuff in there, and thankfully I'm joined also on the stream tonight by Mark himself, who right now is joining us from Ottawa in Canada. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
How's the weather and what time is it? I guess are the two main questions.
It's just coming up at 2:00 in the afternoon, and the weather is really nice for Ottawa. So we don't have snow yet, which is good. We got another couple of weeks before that hits, but it's a nice fall day.
Is Ottawa the type of place where actually everything kind of grinds to a halt when it snows, or are you used to it sufficiently that it's all fine?
Yeah, everything's totally fine. We have more snow removal equipment than most countries do. The only thing that shuts down the airport would be a polar bear hanging off the wing of a plane. We don't shut down because we get about 3 meters of snow over the course of the winter. So it's not a problem.
Yeah, good stuff. Good to see your video production giving mine a run for its money. It's nice to see someone else polishing their stuff. But let's talk a bit about the tech stuff that we're here to talk about before we start veering off into like black magic switches and all that kind of stuff, which I assure you we're going to talk about, but maybe not on this feed. So one question I always have when it comes to grouping permissions for people is, how exactly do you assign groups and put people in those groups? What are the kind of I guess the striations through your organization that you create those groups within? What's the sort of guidance on that?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, John. And it's tricky to find the balance, because if you go too broad, you're going to end up with 2 or 3 groups and people are going to get over permissioned. But if you get too narrow and too specific, then you're going to create a management headache. So
you run out of IAM like group connections as well, right? You can only have 10 at a time or something.
Exactly. It gets kind of ridiculous quickly. So this is where roles really come into play. So I like to think about it as, what are the tasks that needs to get done? And the tasks should really line up with the roles. And then you can kind of figure out your groups based on the people who need to assume various roles. So you can say, well, we know everybody in finance, regardless of which group within finance they are, needs this particular set of workflows, so they can assign these rules. So we're going to put them all into a particular group, because then we can just provide the group with the access to those roles. So there's no hard and fast rule. It's just really kind of try to find that middle ground where you're not going too deep, or you're not going to, or staying too shallow, so that you can really divide it up just to make your role management easier. And that's probably the best way to think about it, is that groups make managing roles simpler.
Right, and you mentioned the finance team there, not traditionally logging into our Amazon accounts very often. I guess using roles is obviously really useful. There's quite a bit of friction in sort of switching between roles and kind of thinking in those terms. Do you have a good a hack or a trick or tooling for I guess educating users on how and why to do that, and why you're putting that friction in their lives, and I guess anything to make that friction as painless as you can, essentially?
Yeah, it's tricky. And I mean, yes, I use finance because I'm ambitious. I want to see the reach extend out. But also I think tools like QuickSight and Athena are horrendously underused, where they can be immensely valuable to teams like finance and other areas in the company. But as far as switching roles, you hit it right on the head. It's a pain. In fact, almost everything to do with IAM and with authentication in AWS, unless you just have one thing to do, is really challenging. So as far as how to make that easier, keep complaining. Keep getting on the AWS team and saying, hey, we need a way to make this smoother. But realistically, it comes down to some level of automation in scripting for yourself to make that context change. So if you have a bunch of tasks to perform under a specific role, I like to think of it, I do a lot of coding in Python. I like to think about it like a virtual environment in Python, where if you've got a specific set of libraries that you want to use, you create an isolated little environment that those libraries are loaded in, and you do all your stuff there, and then you get out of of it. It's the same idea for roles. I'll have a set of scripts or tasks that I do under that role. So I'll context switch into that role, using a little script on my command line or in whatever program or solution I'm in, and then I'll do execute those roles under that and then back out again. But I wish I had a good answer and like, hey, if you just did A, B, and C, it'd be super easy. It's not. It's never going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we tend to use AWS Vault to kind of make that a little bit more comfortable. It certainly solves a lot of that problem. But the challenges always seem to be, I guess, whenever you put a security control in place, it makes somebody's life a little bit difficult, and they don't always see the thing that you are trading their simplicity off for as valuable. And I guess that the education story there is the sort of the key thing. You mentioned educating context, which is of course a really smart way of like we learn in management theory that giving feedback sort of immediately after the thing that you want to feed back on has happened, like attaching sort of education to activities in the way that you described sounds like a great idea. What's the broader education picture look like? How are you thinking about helping teams understand what's important, helping them understand why you're kind of giving them difficult things to do, introducing them to the risk landscape? What does that look like for you from a kind of, I guess, a modernizing security practices perspective?
Yeah, and again, spot on. You're always trading something off when you put a security control in place. And I'll be perfectly honest, the security community generally does a really bad job of explaining that at the time. Look at the adoption or lack of adoption of two-factor authentication on popular, social services in Gmail. We don't explain what the advantage is, where the advantage is massive for a minor interface, friction. So the, most things you see within an organization, especially large enterprises, around security awareness training generally is really bad. A lot of it actually is wrong. So like things around passwords, we've messed that up for years. Passwords are super easy to understand. The longer, the stronger. That's it. Don't worry about them mixing all this blah, blah, blah. Like super long, very strong. So it's really, when you go into talking to people about, hey, you're building in AWS, I don't like to take a traditional security approach. What I like to do is just say the goal of the security perspective is really just to make sure that whatever you're building works the way you want it to and only does what you want it to. And when you come at it from that angle, you start to talk more about resiliency, about availability, and you start to get into more architectural discussions, which is where you can start to make better security decisions earlier on. So I think taking that different approach of saying, instead of coming in and saying, we're trying to stop bad things from happening, or we're trying to, put these controls in place to make sure we hit some weird compliance requirement. You just talk about how the goal of all of this activity of looking at risk and looking at security is really just to make sure that whatever you're building actually works the way you want it to.
Yeah, good perspective. Just as an aside, those of you on the Twitch chat, if you have any questions for Mark that you're itching to ask, please go ahead and type those in the chat, and we'll come to those as and when you do that. Tim actually asked earlier while you were, which you've answered in the chat, but let's do this for the video. Clarifying that the guardrail you were using for secrets manager is on write. You're saying if someone introduces a new secret, then report on who might have access to that. That seems like a good thing to do. You mentioned a different another time you might want to do that. Do you want to explain what that was?
Yeah, absolutely. So the other use case would be anytime that somebody makes a change to the resource policy around that secret as well. That's an area where people tend to make mistakes quite often, and because of the complexity and some of the challenges of understanding how those resource policy works. So you can flag that when there is a change to then essentially just reevaluate and come back and say, okay, you made that change. You thought you opened it up to John and to Mark. You actually opened it up to the entire user group. Was that what you intended? Yes or no? So hitting it there is a really good idea. And again, same workflow works for that. You're just capturing an additional event to trigger it.
Yeah, and I guess the thing that I didn't sort of fully follow in what you were talking about, the sort of yes and no scenario is very straightforward, right? You're denying the thing or you're allowing it. This maybe thing, I think what you're saying is that based on an interaction in Slack triggered by one of these events, you are allowing or denying? Are you sort of rolling back changes as a result of someone saying, "Oh shit, no, I didn't mean to make that quite as public"? So there's a sort of time window where those secrets might actually be open, but you're sort of rolling that back pretty quickly after the fact. Or is there some other kind of gating that you're using to, I guess, stage that change and then prevent it if it was the wrong thing to do?
Yeah, depending on your risk tolerance, you can do either, and that's the beauty of this. And really, the idea of the talk was to highlight that the yes and no tends to be pretty straightforward. You can grant a permission or deny a permission, and so somebody could do something or they couldn't. But there's a lot of stuff in security where practitioners think of it as yes no, when you actually want to extend some level of trust and say, John, you know what you're doing in the environment, but there's still some areas where you may want a reminder because of things changing so much in the AWS side or the complexity of what you're dealing with. So we're trusting you, but we're also going to provide that information in context. So depending on my level of trust, you could even do both, whereas we'll let you make those changes and then ask you afterwards, but only after you've made a few changes where we queued them and verified that they were what you wanted. So you could write it any way you choose. The workflow is the same. And it really depends on the culture that you have within your environment. You may want to divide it between, junior engineers are always queued and the change isn't immediately made until they've confirmed it. Whereas for senior and up, you do make that change and ask after the fact. It's really quite flexible.
Yeah, I think the big thing that's changed for me in my thinking about security over the last few years has been thinking about trust as a continuum rather than a binary. The Zero Trust Networks book from O'Reilly from a few years ago, which doesn't have any sort of technical implementation detail, but talks philosophically about this, talking about actually I trust you like completely if you're on my network and you've logged in with a password and you've given a second factor in a certain time window and you're doing things that you usually do and you're in an office that you're usually in and that kind of stuff, and all of those factors might tend towards a lower trust score somewhere that might encourage that platform to ask you to give it to a second factor again, or just deny access, because actually if you're usually in London and you're usually accessing system A and now you're going routing in the documentation for system B, that might be troublesome, and you should probably flag that with somebody and deny that. So that's the linearity of trust is really interesting. I would posit, I think, that IAM doesn't today have anything to think about trust in those terms, right? Other than maybe guard duty saying, "Oh, this doesn't look like a thing you usually do."
It's starting to, and I like the philosophical approach because I think you start to understand the reasons behind things, and that's really what we're missing in security in general. Is we tend to, as a community, proclaim a lot of things. You will never do this, and we never tell you why. But for IAM on the technical side, it's starting to get better with conditions. The more nuanced the conditions are getting, the more you're able to do scenarios like you said, as far as if you're logging in with your normal credentials and you're coming in over a VPN, things like that, or you're coming from a jump host, you can start to put that nuance in place. It's not as fully fleshed out as I'd like to see it, but it's getting there. But the challenge, I think, is that the demand's not there yet, because it's easier to think of such a complicated topic as trust in the yes/no terms. So people aren't demanding the granularity yet, but it's slowly changing.
Gotcha. So you're a strategist at Lacework. You talk about working with teams. Are these teams within Lacework or customers of Lacework? What's your sort of scope of influence there?
Everywhere. So I work with teams internally for sure. Obviously, we build our solution to the cloud for the cloud, but that's the community hero thing. Just basically trying to modernize security in general. I'm not, I work more on the research and the strategy side, so I'm not as concerned with the product. I don't touch sales or anything like that. I just want to help people understand that security isn't as horrible as they think it is. It's not so yes or no. It's not such a roadblock. There are better ways to do it, and there's reasons to do all this stuff, and it doesn't run counter to the business. So anywhere I can help, I generally try to.
Yep, great stuff. And final bonus question, I suppose. What's the best hero swag you've received from that program?
Good question. There's lots of stuff. So the most useful is probably we got a really nice, like soft, fuzzy blanket a while back. That's great for the winter when you're curling up on the couch. But the most ridiculous I could tell you is a couple years ago we got spinner medals, like big, like 80s hip hop bling medals with AWS Hero that spin in the middle.
Marvelous. Yeah, nothing like that in the Ambassador network. I got a nice rucksack. That's probably the the extent of that. It's got a pocket in the front that's insulated, so you can put a sandwich in it. I thought that was good forward thinking. Anyway, Mark,
nice
thanks for your time. Thanks for putting the video together for us. Hopefully we'll see you again. I imagine we could talk for hours about other things. But yeah, thanks for joining us. We'll see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.